Welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today with Kim, who's a dear friend and was a student in my class. And I'm very excited about the topic we're going to talk about today. Um, and before we dive in, I would just want to tell you a little bit about Kim. So, hello, Kim, first. Hi, how are you?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited about this conversation and talking about UFOs and those phenomena that are, I would say unexplained most of the time, but there is a lot of cultural background about them. It's something that man, humanity have witnessed for a very long time. And today we're going to explore a little bit about this topic, and it's in relation to a class or a course, a lecture that Kim is going to give starting on March 6th. It will be 2.5 hours lectures for 6 Wednesdays. And here we're just going to introduce the topic, but also, share some fascinating fact about it. And I want to tell you a little bit about Kim because very often I think when you think about UFOs and people that have seen them, you think about crazy people or people on the fringe or weird people. And I have to say that Kim definitely has a very strong educational background and takes this subject very seriously. So Kim holds a PhD in philosophy, and like I said, was a past participant in one of our class. But she's currently a philosophy professor at Molloy University, as well as a director of research and development at the John E. Mack Institute. And she has taught courses on the phenomenology of UFOs, UAP, through the Society for UAP Studies, as well as courses on Native American philosophy at her university. Our academic research centers on the lived experience of individuals who have reported UAP encounters, as well as ET contact, as an ongoing lived reality in Native American societies and cultures. And recently, in the summer of 2023, she conducted a formal study of individuals who reported contact with non-human intelligence, NHI, and how such experiences had influenced their belief, their values, and their worldviews. And this research suggested, that UAP UFO encounters are deeply intertwined with contact with non-ordinary realities and new paradigm for understanding consciousness. And that's the reason we're here today, because as you know, shamanic views of the world and mystic perspective of the world are about understanding consciousness and the way it manifests in realities and ways that are maybe beyond what our mainstream culture have taught us. So Kim, welcome. I'm excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here as well and to be having this conversation and to just have this as a platform for discussion of this very important and very interesting topic.
Yeah, when you reach out to me and say, hey, I would like to talk about this, and I guess a part of you was like, I'm not sure he's going to think I'm real, or that maybe that I'm crazy, or is that okay? It's funny because I was, we've known each other for many years, right? But there was this little tension. And I guess when we talk about UAP, UFO, ETs, uh, there's always that little reaction, despite, in fact, so many people, when you have private conversation, like to talk about the subject and often have experience. So before we start and go into the subject, what brought you into those studies? What called you into it? Were you abducted? Were you have an encounter? I'd love to know about that because I don't know. I didn't want to ask you the question before the podcast, before we record.
It's an interesting story, actually. It's not going to be as exciting as is my own abduction account. I don't have a direct, experience or account, but uh, before I dive right into it, I do think you're correct that there's this conception that everybody who is, seriously interested in UFOs is kind of like wearing a tinfoil hat or something like that, and it makes us a little bit hesitant to talk about it. So hopefully through, more discussions like this, we'll see that it actually is, a very common and serious and important thing to be talking about. What brought me here? I as I was growing up, I always was very interested in just accounts and stories of people who had some kind of an encounter. The Hopkinsville encounter that took place in Kentucky really interested me. I actually have memories of being, like I think 11 or 12 years old and being up, at night, just kind of reading about it. It was very interesting to me. And what kind of stuck out to me is that these were very ordinary people who had no reason to lie or make up these stories about what had happened. And especially with Hopkinsville, the people, the police officer who went to investigate the site, he wrote in his notes how terrified these people really were. He said there's no way that this was that they were making this up, or that they were just spooked by some, people were trying to say, oh, they just saw owls or something like that. And really, when you read the account, there was no way. So I always just kind of, it always interested me as a topic, but it was more just kind of like a side interest. And then in December of 2020, I was looking for something to watch before I went to bed, and this documentary was recommended for me, and it's called The Phenomenon and it's directed by James Fox, and it's extremely good. I recommend to everybody to watch it. It's a very recent documentary on UFOs, and I just felt very strongly when it was there in my recommended for you, like, this is something that you're supposed to watch. And so I watched it, and at the end of that documentary, there's an account of the Ariel school encounter, which is an encounter that until then in 2020 I had never heard of. And the Ariel school encounter had 60 witnesses of young children, again, who had no reason to lie. They not only saw a UFO land, but they saw some type of non-human being emerge from the UFO or from the craft, the perceived craft. And they stood by the story to this day. It had profound effects on them, profound, effects on their lives going forward. And I've read some of their testimony, now 20 years later about it. So I was very intrigued by this encounter, but I was also intrigued. There was an individual who went to interview these children who was named John Mack. John Mack, let's see if you can see this book or not. No, with my background, it's not showing up. That's okay. John Mack was a Harvard psychiatrist who was the first person or the first academic to really take seriously the accounts of individuals who have reported contact. He wrote 2 books on the subject, Abduction, and then the second one is called Passport to the Cosmos. And, he was a psychiatrist, and he originally, he was interested because he thought, these people have some kind of psychopathology. They're reporting that they've been, abducted into a craft. But when he actually worked with them, he concluded they did not have any serious psychopathology. And he really became convinced that they were encountering something real, but also something that challenged kind of all of our traditional ways of thinking about physical and non-physical phenomena and what's real and what isn't. And so I read, both of his books, and me as a philosophy professor, as an academic, I just found everything that he was saying so, first of all, kind of mind-blowing to me, because I knew about UFO accounts, but I did not know the details of some of these abduction encounters, and especially to hear it coming from, a very well-educated psychiatrist. So that was kind of like, that was a turning point for me. It was kind of just like a light bulb went off. And I realized that there was something really important here to look at. And so since then, it's only been a little over 3 years, but I've conducted quite a bit of research. I mean, you went over some of it in the beginning. The first thing to do was to read as much as I could. And then last summer, I actually started conducting my own research with people who report contact with NHIs. And another thing in John's second book, in Dr. Mack's second book, he had interviews with 3 indigenous shamans or medicine people. One was from South Africa, one was from Brazil, and one was Native American Choctaw. And their kind of encounters, and that's what actually opened me up to native or extraterrestrial contact, or just the long history of ET contact in Native American societies. And so that then became a kind of a new focal point for me. I was already interested in Native American worldviews. And then this additional, connection with the UFOs, UAP, learning that there's a very long history of indigenous tribes all around the world actually having ongoing contact with, ETs or some type of non-human intelligence, or NHI, also really opened the door for me. In terms of my own contact experiences, I have had one experience that was what we would call a CE5, so a human initiated encounter, where you actually put out the intention that you want to see something. And so we did this, we did the meditation, we put out the intention that we were calling in, that we'd like to have some type of ET contact. And a white orb did come down, and it appeared in the sky above us. It hovered, it was silent, it didn't make any noise. And then it hovered there for about a minute, and then it disappeared. There were 6 of us, and we all saw it. That's my only, somewhat of an encounter, but it was very, very profound for me. But more of it has come really just through this interest in, first of all, John Mack's work was kind of the catalyst, but then understanding contact as an ongoing lived reality for indigenous people for thousands of years, that really kind of opened up a new way of looking at the whole phenomenon.
Yeah, and we're going to go diving a little bit about it today. And just for full disclosure here, I was sharing with Kim before we started the podcast interview here, that video that I personally had an encounter with a craft with my whole family and friends being involved. I was around, I think, 7 or 8 years old. I was at the time in holidays with my family in Corsica, which is a small island in the Mediterranean. And we were having post-dinner board game outdoor. It was a summer. It's very warm in Corsica. So we were just having a nice board game all together. And there was my whole family, probably, 10 to 12 people, some friends. And at some point, the sun was already kind of setting or set, and we were facing the east side of the island where we were on the coast. So, it was quite dark already in the east horizon in the evening. And we saw that very round shapes on the horizon that looked like something really large and far away, kind of metallic, shining, light type of shape, I would say. And that thing came really fast, very close to us. I would say probably 100 foot right above the water, because we were right on the edge of the water. It stayed there for probably, I don't know, probably very short, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And then it flew over us, right above us, very close, I would say 20, 30 foot, and disappeared into the sky at very high speed. It was nothing I've ever seen before, my parents or my grandparents or our friends I've ever seen before, because first it had absolutely no noise, which is very unusual for human craft that are, going at high speed. Obviously, the shape was very unusual, but there was also, and I think that we all remember, and we were really puzzled by it, there was no air movement. There was no wind at that things came up when he flew over us, such a large objects. He was probably, I would say, I don't know, 100 foot in diameter, 150 foot in diameter. So, pretty large. There was no air movement at all and no sound. And the day after, in the local newspaper, there was 7 or 8 encounters by different people on the island. The island is pretty big, probably 200 miles. 20 miles away, 50 miles away, and even one in the south coast of France that same night. And, since then, I've been convinced that there is something else. I spend a lot of night outside because of my work in astronomy. And I've experienced things, but more in a, I would say, far deep sky with unusual movement, unusual lights, things that cannot be satellite or planes in terms of their movement and their speed and all of that. And obviously, there is tons of testimony out there. I've seen the same documentary you mentioned, which I thought was really well done. So probably if you're still listening right now, you're part of the people that believe there is an unexplained phenomenon out there. I want to talk to you a little bit about how is it in our culture today and why did it change so much? Because when I talk to elders, to my teachers in Peru, to elders and teachers in the Native American community that I work with, to literally any traditional culture in the world about the existence of life somewhere else on another planet, or maybe even on this planet, but in forms that are different than ours.
Right.
Visitors, either a spacecraft or even beings, literally nobody look at you like you are crazy. It's something that deeply ingrained and accepted in the culture, and not because people are superstitious, because there are stories about it. And there is even drawings in some cultures. There is literally drawings in the stone or paintings of things that definitely do not look like something normal. And then I would just extend to that. There is, a site in Peru called the Nazca Lines that I visited, I think 10 years ago, which are drawings made with very small stone in the ground, but are only visible from the sky, and you need to take a small plane to see them. And some of those drawings are still unexplained. Some are animals that don't exist on Earth. Some are even, one of them looks like someone in a spacesuit with a kind of a big helmet, like you would see people when they do out of space exploration, coming out of the space station to repair something. It looks very much like that. And some of those lines go over 20 or 30 or 40 miles across mountain, very straight, and looks like landing pads or, unusual lines. And when I've seen them, for me, it was very obvious that, yeah, it was maybe built by humans as we know them, but there is definitely part of it that cannot be explained
Right.
with any knowledge or technology that there could have been at the time of the Nazca civilization in that case. But today, it's kind of a funny subject, right? Like you say, people with a tinfoil hat, right? And people that talk about that are really on the fringe. But then you have people like you mentioned, right? John Mack was a psychiatrist, someone working at Harvard, and didn't find any sign of psychosis or derangement. Or these people were completely mentally normal that had encounters. They didn't have any of the medical sign of people that were what we call crazy. That's maybe something also that we might want to kind of elaborate and discuss. So what is the perception in our culture today? Where are we at? And then, we're going to go back in time and talk a little bit about Native American tribes and other native cultures and the link between those cultures and those other forms of life.
Yeah. So these are really good, important questions here. Where we're at with our current culture, I think there's at least two things when we're talking about kind of the worldview or the kind of philosophy behind why we've started treating this subject the way that we have, and why, until very, very recently, academics who tried to publish and talk about this, were either laughed at or they were denied their funding and grants. John Mack, actually, because of the books that he published, they put his tenure under review, and they put his medical license under review because the things that he was saying were just so contrary to how, our dominant Western culture thinks about these issues. And they're just like, what he's talking about can't possibly be right or can't possibly be real. So one of the things is that Western culture or the dominant culture in our society, is very influenced by anthropocentric humanism. And the philosopher Michael E. Zimmerman has written about this a lot, but anthropocentric humanism is just the idea that humans are the highest intelligence and that they're kind of the sole source of all meaning and value, and that kind of the rest of the world, other living things, only have value if we give them value, because it's kind of just humans are kind of the center of everything. They're the source, not just of all intelligence on Earth, but the source of all of what matters and what doesn't matter. And that's very deeply ingrained in a lot of, I have a PhD in philosophy and studied primarily Western philosophy, and most philosophers are anthropocentric humanists. They do see the kind of the human being as kind of the highest expression of intelligence, and kind of all other life is just kind of secondary and matters only if we think that it matters or if it's useful to us. Another thing that's been very influential, or another concept, is what's called Cartesian dualism. So Descartes was a very influential philosopher in the Western tradition, and he argued that the mind, the physical, and the mental, so the mind and the body, were totally separate, and that the mind was a totally non-physical thing, and the body was physical, and they could only interact through like these clear and distinct ideas, but it was very kind of ambiguous how they could ever interact at all. But it was just this very strong separation between the soul or spirit or mind and the physical body. And then so that's called Cartesian dualism being two, like the mind and the physical, or mind and matter, are totally separate substances, and they can't and they don't interact causally, or it's unclear how they interact. So at one point it became, we kind of went one or two different ways that we broke off from Cartesian dualism. It became this understanding that we moved into kind of the scientific materialism age, and they said, okay, actually just the physical is all that there is, and the mental is just some kind of strange expression of the physical, or this non-physical aspect of human beings that Descartes thought was there just doesn't exist. So that was one branch. And then another branch was, well, maybe there is some type of non-physical soul or non-physical mind, but whatever it is, it's completely unknowable, and it just has to be kind of relegated to the space of faith, and like kind of belief, and like religion, which is seen as kind of in the academy, that's seen as less than the sciences. So that was kind of the two routes that we took from Cartesian dualism. It was either to just say, well, the soul doesn't exist at all, or that the non-physical doesn't exist, or if it does, it's completely unknowable and it's just a matter of faith, and it's completely kind of separate, it's out there somewhere. And that's very different from Native American worldviews, where the spiritual realm is quasi-physical. You can interact with it in physical ways, and spiritual entities can and do manifest in physical ways. There's not this sharp separation. What does any of that have to do with UFOs? It might not be immediately clear, so let me connect the dots. UFOs, or we now call them UAP in the academy, unidentified aerial phenomena. It's just a more academic term, but UFOs or UAP, many times within these encounters, they seem to challenge the physicalist worldview, the materialist worldview. Even what you were describing in your encounter, you saw something that was hovering, it was not making any noise, and then when it took off, it accelerated at this unbelievable speed, and you didn't feel any of the wind or the air that should have come off of that. And that's very common in UAP accounts, is that these objects, whatever they are, they violate the laws of physics as we understand them. And in addition to just the way that the objects move, they accelerate at speeds that are impossible. They don't have they don't experience the air resistance that they're supposed to be. If they were just a normal physical object, they should be experiencing air resistance that they don't experience. They sometimes show up on radars, but sometimes they don't. They there's accounts of Air Force pilots who have fired at UAP, and when they fired, the missiles just kind of like disintegrated when it got near to the UAP. So there's all kinds of ways that these objects and the things that they are reported as doing very consistently just violate the physical laws as we understand them. And so kind of the default reaction is, well, that can't possibly be real then, because that's challenging these assumptions that we have about the physical world. Additionally, UAP encounters are often accompanied by some type of non-ordinary state of consciousness in the experiencer. So they very often, they might receive some type of communication telepathically. There was an account, Jim Peniston, with the Rendlesham Forest UFO. He touched the side of the UFO, and when he touched it, his mind was flooded with this binary code. It's not uncommon for someone who witnesses a UAP to either before, during, or in the aftermath experience some type of non-ordinary state of consciousness that's really, again, kind of violating this barrier between the spiritual or the mental and the physical that the physical sciences really wants to make. And that was something that John Mack really discovered in Passport to the Cosmos. He said, because when he started exploring other indigenous cultures, and he said, crossover phenomena, this idea that it's like some type of entity that exists primarily in another realm, but is capable of crossing over and manifesting in the physical in some way, is very common basically in every other culture except the Western dominant culture that we have right now, kind of the Western scientific culture. It's just this idea that if there are non-physical beings, they don't interact with us. So all of this is to say, kind of combining these things together, the accounts of the descriptions of what UAP do and the descriptions of what people experience when they encounter a UAP violate a lot of kind of scientific tenets that people in our culture are very attached to, or at least the authorities are many of the academic authorities are very attached to, these views, even if it's just the idea that, humans are the sole source of meaning and value. If we take seriously these accounts, we have to really realize that there are, these craft are under intelligent control, and there's an intelligence out there that it's something that we don't have control of, that potentially higher intelligence than human beings. And that just in and of itself, produces a very strong reaction of, we don't want to entertain this. We want to, keep with the idea of, anthropocentrism, human superiority. And so if we take seriously these accounts, we also have to start really questioning some of these very deeply held assumptions that many many scientifically minded people have, or just some of these very deep assumptions that our culture has.
Yeah, and that's very common. I mean, the mystic, the shamanic views, the witches, people that have, let's say, contacts, experience with through rituals, ceremonies, and ways of life with non-ordinary state of reality with what we call the spirit world, the idea that, yeah, we can pick up a stone and have a conversation with it, and it's available to everyone that can soften their mind and let go of their belief. It's only described as crazy by, I always say that the only people that describe those things as crazy is people that have never tried it.
Right.
They've never experienced it. They never sat in those ceremonies. They never tried to have that communication. And that's kind of fascinating to me that it's the point of view, right? I think science is a little bit more open now to those altered state, to those views, right? And there's a lot of things that we've qualified as um, problem of dissociation in the mind and maybe an illness. And now we realize, oh, maybe there is something else, because native communities and ancient communities say, no, this person is not sick. Maybe this person has a way to communicate with other realities or with the world that is different than us. So you mentioned, and one of the topics that we'll be exploring in the class, and I want to kind of shift gear and talk a little bit about, is the connection between those abduction people that say, well, I've been abducted, or there is this kind of contacts. In fact, I've kind of one personal terrifying story about it, but I won't share it here, but I'm pretty certain that it's a possibility, let's say. And so those accounts and the process of shamanic initiation, right, where people go through great transformation, right, usually through vision quest or plant medicine ceremony or other ways where people literally rebirth themselves, and very often can come out of it without an addiction that they have had for 20 years, or with a complete shift in consciousness, usually with recovering their own power and their own health. So can you tell us a little bit about the connection? Because I'm really interested. What is the connection between the two? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a really good question. There have been a couple of really interesting articles written on this recently. But actually John Mack was the first to really make this connection, because so in the abduction experiencers that he worked with, let's start with them. And let's talk about what an alien abduction is like. So these individuals, they were giving accounts of either when they were kind of walking alone at night, or in their cars, or in bed. All of a sudden they'd see a very bright light. They'd feel themselves paralyzed. They'd feel themselves often floated through walls or windows. Or through the roof of a car. So they feel themselves taken, and they pass through these physical objects. They don't know how, but they do, and taken into a craft. Once they're on board the craft, they experience seeing, often there's beings standing around them, the traditional with the big black eyes, and they perform some type of medical procedures on them. Often related to, sometimes placing things up the nose into the brain, also related to reproduction. And then after the medical procedures, they usually receive some type of communication. Often the communication had to do with the environment, and kind of, either the environment or nuclear disaster, and kind of saying, if you don't stop treating the earth this way, you're going kind of down the wrong path, and showing, pictures of environmental and ecological destruction. And then these people would find themselves back in their beds or back in their cars. And the skeptic who hears these accounts thinks, well, obviously they're just, dreaming or hallucinating, or lying. Some of them have been accused of lying. But Dr. Mack found that they were very sincere, and that often what had happened to them was very traumatizing initially. Because it was very terrifying to people who have never, if you've grown up in our culture and you've been told that non-human intelligences aren't real, when you go through an experience like that, you would have literally what Dr. Mack called ontological shock. So it's just this process of having an experience that challenges everything that you thought you knew about reality. Everything you thought you knew about what is real and what isn't real is just kind of thrown into question, and you're in just a state of like literal shock and trauma. So many of the people that he worked with were showing signs of PTSD. They were very traumatized by what happened to them. Additionally, again, lest the skeptics say this is all in their mind, many of them would wake up with if on the craft they had a needle put in their head, they would wake up with a puncture wound. They'd wake up with marks on their body. Many of them experienced ongoing nosebleeds because with the feeling that like something had been shoved up their nose. Many I have felt that there was some kind of object implanted in them somewhere. Some experiencers have found afterwards, they like went to the doctor and the doctor had told them like, you've had surgery. And they said, no, I've never had surgery. And the doctors were like, well, yes, you've had surgery. I met with one experiencer. I interviewed her over the summer. One of her ovaries had been surgically removed, and that she has, there's no medical history of this happening, but she had ongoing abduction encounters, and afterwards one of them was gone. So there's physical evidence of these encounters as well. It's subtle. It's not like a smoking gun that would necessarily convince a hard skeptic, but it's evidence that it's not all existing just in the mind. It's not just a hallucination. So Dr. Mack worked with these people who at first many of them were very terrified, traumatized, and it was this process of really just being taken into this very foreign environment and having this this intrusion on them and their bodies and also their whole worldview. But the more that he worked with them, he found that many of them eventually began to go through a very significant process of transformation, where this abduction experience or experiences, because it's usually not just once, were kind of this catalyst to opening them up to the possibility of other intelligences, to the possibility of kind of non-ordinary realities, to the possibility of kind of spiritual realms, to an understanding of all life forms as connected. And so it actually serves a transformative process very similar to the shamanic initiation process, where they emerge from this deeply troubling experience that challenges everything they thought they knew about reality and kind of come out on the other side with a whole different worldview, a whole different way of thinking about consciousness, of thinking about reality, of thinking about our connections to other beings. And so in my work with experiencers this summer, I worked with people who self-reported a experience with a non-human intelligence, and then I asked them questions about how these experiences had affected their values, beliefs, and worldviews. And many of them had shifted very considerably to a worldview in which they were seeing everything as connected, everything as one, in which they were seeing plants and animals as also conscious beings that we could communicate with. The understanding of consciousness itself as kind of non-local, and that we can, tap into a first of all, a deeper consciousness, but we can also communicate with beings in non-local ways and telepathic connections, psychic connections. They also had a shift in just their ethical values. They had turned away from materialism and really caring about, money in the material world, and kind of turning away from really a decreased interest in politics, in more a turned towards a form of spirituality that was more universal and kind of about, looking for the divinity in everybody and everything rather than, a particular religious tradition. So this process, this, as I said, this alien abduction account, at least what they perceive as being an abduction, and Mack actually, he tried very hard to give an account of exactly what aspects he thought were happening in the physical world and what aspects of the encounter might be happening in some type of a non-ordinary or spiritual world. And that's still a bit of an open question. But this experience, as traumatic as it was, opened them up to a different reality and a very different way of looking at reality. And in many, not all, but many of these experiencers, it represents a significant shift in their life path, their worldview, and their values. Matthew Roberts was an experiencer on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. He saw the famous gimbal footage that came out in 2015. He wrote a book about his experiences in the aftermath, and he titled it Initiated, because that sighting, he says, was kind of his initiation into a whole different way, not just the sighting, but everything that happened in the aftermath of the sighting, because he had quite a few experiences afterwards. But he says that whole process really opened him up to an entirely different way of thinking about the world and thinking about reality, and kind of put him in touch with these kind of spiritual dimensions of reality that he was completely removed from prior to that.
It's really fascinating listening to this shift in values and perception of the world, because that's really, very often how people come out of shamanic initiations and rituals, and with a heart that is more open, with a connection to the respect of all lives, with a less materialistic and a life that is more based on relations, on the sacredness of all life. Kind of out of the mind into the heart type of life. What's fascinates me is that a lot of the time it's very ordinary people. It is not people that are on shamanic path or trainings, or not native people that believe in it. It's like, Mr. Random that is driving his car somewhere in the middle of Ohio, right, to his farm,
right,
and kind of get put through that experience, which also for me is, one of the proof that it's real, because a lot of those people, including, police officers and military people and academics, those people have literally nothing to gain in society from this revelation, because very often they're going to be fired or ostracized or, mocked off. And in fact, I'm pretty sure a lot of people have had this experience but never talk about it because they don't want to be making fun of. But I have a question for you a little bit. Is there, because when you go through shamanic initiation, when you go through those practices, either you're in a traditional cultures and there's a cultural context, there is a post ceremony or pre-ceremony, there's a lot of holding and love and support to go through this transformation. You don't just go on a vision quest. There's a whole preparation to it. But here it happens not only to people that have absolutely no understanding and, preparation for it, but also to people that then come back to a community that literally has no tool to hold it. And worse than that, is just going to try to make them feel like they are crazy, right? And do you think is one of the explanation also that maybe some of the experience for some people are kind of traumatic, and also why it's maybe underreported because of these two aspects, because it's not in our worldviews. And when you come back from it, the more story you hear about it, people are kind of making fun of. And maybe there's people listening to this and kind of laughing, right now, and thinking, okay, this is just insane and crazy, right? So there's a lot of resistance. And I don't know if it was even happening to me tomorrow to have such experience. if I would really come forth with it, because I would know all the potential, consequence about it, and I may not want to share about it, and but yeah, we have those, fighter pilots and people in the armies and policemen and the sheriff and one of the incidents that you mentioned, literally normal people. So I want to kind of weave that question into kind of a question about, do we have any idea why, if this is coming from somewhere else, from another form of life, why would they choose those people and why would they do that? What is the goal? Is there any goal, or do we have any idea on all the encounters? And is there some kind of patterns that seems to be emerging aside from the one and you mentioned about what they're seeing and, kind of value shifting, right? Is there something else that we can try to have some kind of understanding, maybe, if we can?
It's a very interesting question. Um, and to be honest, there is going to be some research coming out of the John Mack Institute where we're trying to look for patterns and look at these exact questions. And one of them is one of the questions we're going to be asking is, um, can we see a pattern in who is being chosen for these experiences? Because part of the problem is there hasn't been a lot of serious academic research done on this, because no academic wants to take it seriously, because they saw what happened to Dr. Mack. He got his tenure, they put him basically on trial. So it's difficult to kind of look at the metadata in terms of different researchers who have taken this up seriously, David Jacobs, John Mack, looking at people that Bud Hopkins interviewed or worked with. I do want to go back. I'll say more on that in a second. When you were talking about, in Western culture, when you have this experience, there's no community to come back to. That is a very significant problem, and it's kind of a further form of trauma. And I've actually written a couple of short essays about it, because it really is an epistemic injustice. It's individuals reporting an experience and not being taken seriously, not being seen as reliable, credible knowers, and not having anywhere to get support for that experience. So one experiencer, she spoke at a conference, about a year ago, and she had worked with Dr. Mack, and she talked about her experience trying to find someone to listen to her before she found him, and she said she went to even MUFON, which is, the Mutual UFO Network. And she said, that was just kind of a group of scientists who were doing, readings on UFOs, and they really didn't want to hear a story about an abduction, to be honest. And she said she went to the most open-minded therapist that she knew, and they handed her a prescription for an antipsychotic and said, you're experiencing extreme psychosis. And so many of the people who finally found Dr. Mack found him after, basically searching and having nowhere to discuss these experiences. And the culture is shifting a little bit. Something we're trying to do is, our team at the John Mack Institute is starting, groups that are led by professionals for people who have had experiences, if they want to come and get some kind of support, because our society just completely lacks that support. So it's like, not only did this happen to you, but it happened to you, and now you have nowhere, no one to talk to about it. And kind of the more that you talk to people about it, the more isolated that you feel. And that's a very common thing. I mean, I think almost all of the experiencers that I worked with this summer, when I asked them about, epistemic injustice, or, had they felt isolated after their, encounters, and it was just, yes, they had. They felt they themselves were crazy. They felt the more people they told about it, the crazier they felt.
Mhm.
And so it's a real problem in our culture that just has no socially recognized ways for talking about these experiences, other than to pathologize them and say, I'm sorry, you need to be medicated, is really the kind of the default kind of official reaction of society. And that really is a serious moral harm, and something that, we're working hard to try to change that culture so that you can talk openly, speak openly about this, and be supported, because that's so important. The reason that many of Mack's experiencers were able to then kind of shift their thinking and have this profound change in values was because they finally found someone who listened to them and took them seriously and offered them a place to speak meaningfully about this, and felt themselves supported, and then were able to, reframe everything that had happened to them, and kind of move forward from it in a more positive way. In terms of the, why why are they doing that? Why are they choosing these people? Again, it's really still an open question. I mean, it's kind of the $1 million question, right? It's um so many experiencers, as I said, they walk away with kind of a new understanding of consciousness, and a new, uh, framework of kind of interconnectedness. And so some have hypothesized that, this is all part of, a process of kind of the evolution of consciousness, and that they're working on us in subtle ways to, kind of open us up to new ways of thinking, kind of new understandings, and it's part of a, evolution of consciousness. That still doesn't really answer the question of why certain people are being chosen for this more than others. But I do want to say I personally know two researchers who are very interested in that question of why are these people being chosen, and they are, as we speak, seeking funding, and getting started on, very serious, multi-year studies trying to answer that exact question, and
Mhm.
look at these, try to identify what the patterns are in the people who are reporting these experiences, why these individuals and not others. Are there things that are actually different about them in terms of even, their physical bodies, and their do their brains work differently, looking at, like, brain imagery and things like that. So these are very important questions that, because the academy really didn't want to do any research on this beyond what Mack did, um there isn't a definitive answer to it yet, but there are people who are, working on it. um Again, some have hypothesized, and I think, me speaking as an individual, of the enough accounts that I've heard of people who are making this very profound shift in their thinking and their ways of interacting, it does seem to be related to the evolution of human consciousness. It does seem to be related to, it just triggers some kind of shift in thinking. But why they're choosing these people and not others, what exactly is the the big plan, the grand design, that's still an open question, but I think it's one that's really exciting, and that I'm excited to be part of, various initiatives that are trying to answer it.
Mm. Thank you for that. I mean, I have many multi-million-dollar questions. I think many more. It's a subject that is quite fascinating, and I really love that. You're also researching and in contact and having discussion with people that it is part of their culture. Native culture, traditional cultures, which have explanation, which have answers for many of those questions, right? And I think, any great progress on the subjects that mix the soul and the body, or the mind and the spirit, and this reality and other reality obviously needs to include people which still that connection. I mean, in their way of life, in their understanding of the world. And I think we obviously have a lot to learn from that. So, um, anything you want to share as we concluding here? Any other message, and then I'm going to remind people a little bit about what's coming up, and well, we'll let you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you brought up the Native American worldview, so I'll just speak a bit on that, because, so as we have the Western tradition, and the scientific tradition, and kind of the lens that they're looking through, and then we have the indigenous and Native American people who have been communicating with these beings for thousands of years, in their cultural traditions. And as you know, many Native American people even have in their creation stories that they came from star people or sky people. They don't call them aliens. It was that they themselves are descendants of people from the stars, and that because they are descendants of people from the stars, they are, the people who are being abducted or are being, checked up on by kind of our star ancestors, right? So it's really ongoing contact with ancestors. But it's not just the stories. It's really in Native American and other indigenous communities around the world, contact is an ongoing lived reality. So the experiencers that I've worked with that came from Native American traditions had a very different reaction, to even the abduction experience, because for them, this was part of their worldview. This was part of something that they understood. This was communicating with the same beings that their ancestors had communicated with. And many shamans and many medicine people, report contact with kind of sky beings or star beings as part of the medicine or just part of the wisdom that they receive and the ongoing knowledge that they receive. So yeah, the question really, the answer to it really depends quite considerably on who you're asking. So absolutely, I say often, it's called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. You ask Native American people, we're not in a search for for extraterrestrial intelligence. We've been having contact with ETs for centuries. It's been an ongoing lived reality. And so it doesn't have the same ontological shock to people from indigenous cultures as it does to people who are saturated in the Western culture, because they realize, or because for them, this is, part of their ongoing lived reality. I know we need to wrap up, so I can.
That's okay. Take your time. It's
Okay.
fascinating.
um, and part of the reason for that is, I said earlier, Western culture is so saturated in anthropocentric humanism and Cartesian dualism. In Native American cultures, they're not. They're very open to the possibility of other types of intelligences. They communicate with other types of intelligences, whether that's, their human ancestors or spiritual beings or extraterrestrials. All of that is part of their ongoing lived reality. RD6 Killer Clark did a series of interviews with contemporary Native Americans, some of them on and off reservations, but who have had, ongoing sightings, ongoing contact. And again, it's looked through a very different lens than in the Western tradition, because it's not looked at as something that's obviously pathological or can't possibly be real. It's something that is understood as part of an ongoing process of lived contact and communication with beings who we've been in contact with for many hundred years, if not thousands of years.
Yeah. So much more, right?
I was gonna say I can keep going. I don't
I feel
know.
like, yes, this is fascinating subjects, and probably like me, you have, more questions. And Kim, I really appreciate the time and the efforts, and also your dedication, to work in a very open way to it, first with the scientific method and, with your background also as a researchers, but also open to include, other worldviews and really bringing something that's really potent, I think, when we bring them together, right? So for people that are listening here on YouTube or on the podcast, just a reminder that this 6-week deep exploration of UAP UFO phenomenon and its connection to shamanic practice, to ancient initiations, to non-ordinary state of consciousness will start on March 6th. It's a Wednesday evening. There is going to be 6 classes. They're going to be live and recorded. I really, really recommend that you join Kim. Hopefully you get a little taste of her knowledge today. But I will be going around many of the subjects we explore in this podcast. And I think, if you're interested to explore that, if it's a personal subjects or you want to hear more, please join the class and explore it more. But anyway, Kim, I want to thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to connect with you today. Thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for reaching out for this conversation, because you reach out to me and I'm really happy to help with our platform to get this conversation out. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you everyone, and a blessed day to you. And maybe tonight when you go look at the dark sky, maybe you will have a little winkle to our ancient ancestors that are up there. Thank you everyone. Have a good rest of the day.